to Mind Crime Liberty Show with me, Scott Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, are non-profits profitable for society? A few weeks ago, I had a conversation with a friend of mine, and he was very much against companies making profit. This is in the context of sort of like global warming and environmental damage and stuff like that. And this was a problem because these firms are doing these things for profit, and that was a bad thing. And then it got me thinking that, well, actually, profit isn't a bad thing at all, because it made me think of some thoughts I'd had in the past on how do we determine whether an organization is performing well or not. When it comes to a for-profit organization, you know if it's performing well, or at least relatively well, if it's making profits. Because if it's making profits, that means it's producing things that the consumers want in general. And it means that they're using their resources relatively efficiently because they're making profits. So we're getting what people want to be produced at the lowest resource cost you can, which, seems like a good metric to see whether a firm is performing well or not. The problem, though, arises if you have non-profits, because, well, how do the donors, so you think about, in the case of a firm, as it were, the donors to the firm are the customers. In a non-profit, you have donors, and the question is, well, is the organization doing things that the donors want them to do? To which the answer is, well, you don't know. It's hard to tell because they're not making profits, and also that they're not the direct recipient of the good or service that the organization is attempting to provide. So, for instance, if it's a non-profit about feeding the homeless or something, well, since you're a donor, you're not homeless. You have absolutely no idea whether they provide the appropriate food you need at the right times in the right places. You wouldn't know that. Now, there might be ways of finding out, but in general, charities are almost as if like they're crowdfunded, that any individual doesn't put very much money in. So the motivation to try and figure out whether they're doing this or not is very low, which then leads us to suspect, well, do non-profits then end up not running for the sake of doing what the donors want them to do, but just running for themselves, and in a sense then just become a shakedown operation or a racket? And it seems to me that that's something quite difficult to avoid. There are two possible there's one major exception to this. You could say that the family is a non-profit organization, but the difference there is that the funders of the family unit is, take the husband or father. He's directly involved in it, so can determine whether it's running well or not. So you don't have that distance. With respect, and another one which is they get around a little bit is churches or other religious ones, because at least some of the services the donors would receive. So typically the congregants will tithe or give some form of donations to the institution, the church, and they'll spend it on various different activities. But at least some of the activities, the donors will be a direct recipient, and then can tell whether they think it's doing what they wanted to do or not. And if they don't, they can leave and stop donating. So I think the churches in general are reasonably good at that. But for other nonprofits, it does seem to be a big problem. So, Tim, do you think I've accurately outlined the problems that nonprofits have, or do you think that this problem afflicts for-profit organizations? And are you aware of any sort of charities or nonprofits that do actually perform well? And what things could be used to try to make the non-profits run better? And by which run better, I mean in the interests of the donors, or basically what the donors want.
I would say that some nonprofits are profitable but they're I think in the mosque sense, their stated goal is not their actual goal, and their actual goal is not their stated goal. Very large philanthropic organizations seems to be like just increasing the power of the owners. And, it's like I think certain foundations, that is obviously the case. They're more or less just front organizations for their owners. I don't think this is hard to figure out. Just read a book by Whitney Webb or someone like that. Um, but as far as churches and those other organizations are concerned, I'm not talking about these, the richest people in the world's foundations. I'm just talking about like local ones. Then that's more interesting here, because these people seem to want to do good motives, yet they don't. There is the idea of telescopic altruism, which was a used in some 1880s. I think Charles Dickerson, or no, it was G.K. Chesterton, I think it was, or C.S. Lewis. They made fun of people look through a telescope to helping people thousands of miles away rather than helping people close to them. So I do think the problem you're identifying, in a sense, although you might think it's new, is not necessarily new here. That people are more interested in helping people, thousands or millions. You can see them through a telescope. Um, and I think this might underlie one of the problems with charity in itself, which I think you've identified, is that unlike a business, there is no easy metric to look at it. Uh, uh, and there could be, and this is something, if I think Curtis Yarvin, aka Moldbug, has a good article on criticizing the effective altruism movement, which it's is there could just be piles of bodies associated with a lot of charitable organizations. Like I'm not saying feeding the homeless is a problem, but there are certain charitable organizations where they might create more problems than they do. They do. I think you can read someone like Michel Foucault. You can read someone like Milton Friedman. One of those things they'll say about welfare is it reduces people's powers and makes them dependent on charitable organizations. So now that's state charity, which isn't really charity because taxation isn't really charity. But going back to your question of charitable organizations, is I don't know what the answer is. I think you identified a good problem here, but I don't really see any way to resolve this question. Swithin?
I don't think you can resolve it, and I suppose as well. I mean, does a firm perform well, even if it makes profits? I suppose you're then going to get questions of, well, you've got various firms that make more profits because of regulation, licensing, etc. So I suppose the way one might want to frame it is, um, you know, charities in a free or freed market or something, or firms in a freed market versus charities in a freed market. Um, but I think it's an intractable problem. I think to the extent that the person who pays for a service is not the person who receives it, and there's some sort of intermediary somewhere, then it's always going to be worse than if they pay for it directly. Now, of course, if there was no payment at all, then worse is better than nothing, potentially. But I think that's always going to be the case. I think that was one of the criticisms actually leveled at sort of insurance-based healthcare stuff, getting the third party involved and getting hospitals to do things basically in the interest of insurance companies because they're the people pay via the insurance company, introduced additional costs, etc., and didn't really do what the patients really wanted to do. A way that you could avoid, well, you wouldn't really avoid it, but you could mitigate this, I think, is to try to create a charity or non-profit which trying to non-profit that had simple, clear goals of things that they wanted to achieve and have separate campaigns, and to have the organization create have different pots of money for different campaigns, and people could donate not to the organization in general, but it would be sort of like a ring fence donation. So this money needs to go to this fund, and then it would be much easier in that case for the donor to know whether or not the organization has achieved the goal that it set out to achieve. Because if you just give money to a charity in general, let's just take one like the World Wildlife Fund. Oh no, sorry, it's the World, whatever it's called now, the Worldwide Fund for Nature or something. I mean, how does any donor there know it's doing something well? I mean, they can talk about all these things that they do, but specifically what they actually do, I mean, it's not like you have to really dig for it, and to the extent that a donor needs to dig is a problem. And then, of course, you get situations where the organizations get captured and they don't do what you think they'll do. So, an example of this now, they may do good work as well. So, this may be uncharitable. However, I remember looking. Oh, I wanted to find out, how about persecuted Christians in around the world. So I looked at an organization called Open Doors. So I thought, oh, good, this is information on that, and they're going to put money to help Christians not being killed or otherwise significantly harmed in sort of predominantly the Middle East and other places. But all their marketing seems to be evolved around women being forced to wear hijabs in Iran, and I'm like, why are you caring about this? I mean, this doesn't seem to be what the organization, at least ostensibly, is engaged in. Now, that said, they could well get lots of money for that because maybe people are motivated to rail against hijab wearing. But to me, it didn't seem what the organization was set up or what was supposed to do. So it does seem that having smaller pots may be able to make it easier to determine whether they're doing what they're supposed to do. You could also, you could always get the non-profit that's the watchman for all the non-profits. It produces reports. Does it do what it says it's supposed to do? But then, of course, how do you know whether that organization is doing what it's supposed to be doing? I suppose isn't obvious. I suppose. But that would be another way. And I think I've heard of an organization in America that does that, although that would be interesting to check. You mentioned the sort of front organizations from billionaires. In a way, even though they're clearly two-faced, because what their stated goal isn't their actual goal, given that their donor is like one very rich man, they're at least, hopefully doing what he wants them to do, even if that's not their stated goal. So at least in that case, you have a matchup of preferences and action in a way that you don't tend to with these sort of disparately funded charitable organizations. So in a way, those foundations aren't a problem. I suppose, though, you could say that they do become a problem after the initial founder dies and he creates like a fund that his children or someone else do. Because that was one of the claims with respect to, say, the Ford Foundation, that Henry Ford wouldn't really have agreed with the ethos and what the Ford Foundation ended up doing, but he ended up setting up, and it was sort of run by, you could claim, his own enemies, although to what extent his children were involved, I'm not sure. Yes, and then related to this, of course, you always end up with the Robert Conquest's law that any organization which isn't explicitly right-wing ends up being left-wing, which I suppose is another consideration here. But what do you think about the massive foundations and my potential way of mitigating the problems of more disparately funded organizations to have smaller sort of pots that are sort of ring fenced so that it would be easier for donors to figure out what they were actually doing? Or do you think that's likely to be impractical or wouldn't make much difference?
I think it depends on the goal. I think I would just say I'm on an a priori level suspicious of charity. It just doesn't seem. There is an idea that exists. I think it exists. This is, my Protestant English type area where if you're offered something, it's almost an affront. Now, again, merely saying this kind of taboo, in a sense, unwinds it here. But there is a sense in which if you do something for somebody else, do you have to do something back to them? Like that kind of charity. Now, not everyone follows this, but like there is that kind of unwritten rule that somewhat somewhere exists here. So in that sense, I think charity. This might make me very unchristian or Randian on a philosophical level here, but I do think that charity, in a sense, is suspicious to begin with. Here, I'm not against. I'm not going to say I think it's all bad or I'm against it or anything like that. I think part of the problem is exactly what you're saying. So like if you want to help uh, the quote unquote homeless here, you should might ask them why they're homeless and do they want to be homeless? Because if they want to be homeless, which sounds crazy, but people have asked people this question. Uh, they just want a place to pitch their tent and lay left alone in the woods. Um, you know, you're that I don't want to be homeless necessarily here. So if you want to ask that question to me, but on like other questions here, like when you're trying to resolve Christian persecution around the world, like I don't really know how that's quote unquote solvable. Considering like what kind of goal would that look like? What would a society without homeless people or whatever, without hungry people would look like? And it seems like just having it seemed like having cheaper food would actually be a better way to do it. And the way to have cheaper food is to read Alex Epstein and not have state embargoes on oil or state restrictions on oil production or natural gas production. So it seems like again the real way to help them is the quote unquote mark. It's not charity here. At my parents' church, my dad used to always make fun of people who would want to run. Like he said, why don't you just, he would say, why don't you get just a second job and then donate that money at the second job rather than setting up some scheme or you sell cookies or whatever uh, uh, at the church here. Like because really you can make more money for the organization that way. So in that sense, I'm always suspicious of like charity as charity. And I think Joel Osteen is in a sense right. The critics, the Joel Osteen, if you, not that I know much about him, but like, churches are a kind of business. So like when you bring up nonprofits here, churches are a kind of business in the sense that they do have a product that's called service. That's called a congregation. If the congregation keeps reproducing or they bring in more people than that leave, and they'll continue. It's just like a movie theater in that sense. You can keep some bad movies and bad movies go bad in the sense that people don't buy them or buy them on DVD going for some time, but eventually the system folds. Now people don't like viewing it in that crass manner. If the organization is long enough and entrenched enough, it might take maybe a century to kill it. But in that sense, churches are a kind of business, as you just sort of stated. Which again, people who go to church who don't like charity, who like charity, are going to will get annoyed at that. Even like quote unquote good churches. So I just think some of the goals, and like if you really want to resolve world hunger, it seems like there's other methods to go about it, or it's just an original like a problem of evil in a sense here. So again, I'm not opposed to charity, but I would just simply say, like, if you want to open up a successful restaurant, you know what a successful restaurant looks like. If you want to open up a successful, like, tire changing shop or something like that, or car tires changing shop, you know what that looks like. If you want to open a successful tour guide business, I mean, in some city or tutoring firm, you know what that looks like. The students are doing slightly better on their tests. People are learning about local history. People are getting their cars fixed. People are eating good food. Okay. But if you want to like solve homelessness or help, I don't know, the handicapped or help, I have no clue what some of these goals just seem so open ended. And I will point out, not that this is a non-profit. There's one of my favorite political science papers is the idea that the Red Cross and Doctors Without Borders lengthen civil wars. It's a simple idea. It's not that hard to figure out. I mean, if you ask this in other ways, like if you let if you know if you broke the blockade in World War I, like there was a whole British strategy, it's a whole Israeli strategy currently toward Gaza. It was Grant's strategy toward Robert E. Lee in Richmond. Would that lengthen the war or shorten the war? Okay, so now again, I'm not for wars, by the way, but there is a sense in which, if you're going to have them as quickly as possible, again, moving with rather than protracting them, and nonprofits could play a role in extending them because people want to keep them in. It's this kind of form of telescopic non-skin in the game type morality there. So that's my comment. I'm very suspicious of charities, and I wouldn't say the family or churches are charity or non-profitable organizations in that sense. Like people start families because they want, like there's a kind of egoism. Again, some of the defenders of families might not like to hear that, but there's some kind of egoism there. If you want to have your kids, and applies for the wife too. You're not having other people's kids. This isn't Plato's guardian class here, where we don't know the parental heritage of the children. So in a sense, you're raising your DNA. You're raising your last name or whatever. It's not You're not raising someone else's. So I would come back to the question of, like, what what kind of goal do you have? What does an achievable goal look like? Now it could be, and this might be the left wing criticism of capitalism, which is the case, is that there are certain goals that don't get pursued because on some a priori level they don't fit in within capitalism. But something like good health, like we've done a few episodes on good health. I have no clue what that looks like. I mean, that's not fair. You have some idea that looks like, but like like a perpetual state paid tax funded healthcare system. Like, even if everyone has good motives, which, by the way, if everyone has good motives and everyone is in agreement of what the good motives are, why do you need the state to pay for it? It always begs the question there. But even an organization had almost near infinite resources. It seems like this is like a problem which doesn't have an easy solution. Yes, I agree that fixing broken legs and fixing limbs that's good, but most, like, you might, even in the American system, that will happen. You can probably just, like, go to the hospital under a fake name or found some crowd sharing thing or put it on. In that sense, that's already been accomplished, but that's accomplished because of modern technology. And the extent the state makes it drives it up the chip. This goes back to my initial previous comments, where like, why does it cost so much to go to a doctor? Well, blah 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 blah. You know the answers on these episodes here. So, Switha, what do you make of my comments about questioning the whole purpose of nonprofits and so forth, outside of their unstated quiet goal? What would you make to those comments here? And what do you make of my comments about churches and families? And there's some kind of egoism in there that keeps them in line. Then that's what's driving them to work, in the sense that there's other organizations, they're just kind of like, people don't care.
Yeah, I'd agree entirely with the egoism point. I think that, as I stated in my opening, that I think that's what keeps them together, is because the recipient of the service or is the funder, and so there's that direct link. And I think to the extent that they're severed, you get the problem. You make a good point about what is the goal, and is the goal even achievable? So if it's a case of it's Christian organization stop persecution in the Middle East, well, a mob boogie would be like, well, or a sort of an elite theorist of Italian realist school.
Keep Muammar Gaddafi and Saddam in charge. That would probably be the best
Well,
solution.
yeah. I know. It's like just well, what you need is a strategy to control the reins of power, and then be all right. Which I'm pretty sure is not what they're intending to do, because otherwise they'd be kicked out of the. They would not be able to operate openly. It would seem to me, though, that the best thing you could do, although I've not run this, I don't know, but it would seem to me the best thing to do would just be use it as a front organization to give money to actual Christians and churches in Iran, for instance, because it's going to be a lot easier for them to operate if they've got more money. and not because well, my understanding of the Middle East is that uh, corruption is not unusual. So if it was the case, oh no, you could be persecuted, it's like, well, just pay them and they'll leave you alone. That would seem to be much more productive than getting Iran heckled in the UN or something. So again, sending the money over may well be a better option. And another thing as well, you raise a good point on homelessness. You're exactly right on homelessness. Some homeless men in particular want to be homeless. You might not think it's a good idea, but that's what they want to do. And I think there is a an issue with many charitable organizations is a very sort of strong paternalistic streak that, well, even though you don't want to be helped, then, well, we need to help you. And it's like, well, I suppose you could, I mean, in certain like very extreme circumstances, you might think that that's justifiable. For instance, severe level of mental retardation, other things like that, maybe, or their cognitive faculties clearly aren't functioning properly. They keep saying that there is somebody following them, or they keep the walls are talking to them, stuff like that. In those cases, yeah, maybe. But in most of these cases, that's simply not the case. It's just these people don't want to live in the way that the organisation thinks they ought to. And I think really with the stated goals of these organisations, what you want to do, and I do agree, giving people money is tricky. What you need to do is you need to give it to them with strings attached, so that they don't just use it as like a government subsidy, so that they can actually turn their life around if they wanted to. So if someone's poor, you help them with like financial management and stuff, and maybe you subsidize them a little bit. But if they end up blowing all the money, you just cut the money off eventually. The goal is really that you should be some sort of responsible individual of some description, and so you can manage your own finances. That's kind of the goal. The goal isn't for you to be a permanent sort of loafer, for instance. Problem is, of course, is that if the charity was successful, then it would go out of business, which is kind of one of the problems of charities. Is if they succeed in what they're doing, then they don't need them anymore, which of course is a problem, because then you always have to try and find new problems to solve. On your point that your dad mentioned, why are you doing this cookie sale at church? Why don't you work an extra job and donate it? I have sympathy with that view, although in certain circumstances, the goal is trying to build up relationships with actual individuals in these kind of organizations. So a direct sort of sale makes sense because it has additional sort of relationship building elements. But yeah, and in many cases, yeah, just work an extra job and donate the money would make sense. On organizations, you said these big billionaires who remain nameless for the time being have big foundations. If I was a multi-billionaire, I wouldn't create a foundation. I would just pay people that I liked, who I thought produced good work, and I would just subsidize them. And I would have my own researchers, and I want them to find stuff out for me. And basically, everybody would report to me, and I would pay them, and they would do what I wanted them to do. And if it was the case that I died and my children wanted to continue to do the same thing, then I would tell them to do the same thing. And if they didn't, they used the money otherwise. I would just I still, as of yet, have not come up with a good way of being able to create some sort of permanent foundation that doesn't just end up going about wanting donations all the time, and it just functions as a racket. I think it was Doug French who had a PFS talk when movements become rackets, which I think is a very big problem. As an aside with that, the Mises Institute in America seems to have done quite well. Of a relatively well-known, or at least in our circles, charitable organization, it doesn't seem to have been captured, and it still does seem to be doing the same thing that it was supposed to do, which is to produce educational materials and educating the Austro-Libertarian school, and it does seem to still be doing that. So it's not that it's not possible. I don't have any personal insights or any sort of people I know who work there to see why it works. Although it would be interesting to see how it would work if Lou Rockwell died. That would be an interesting transition because he's kind of like the founder of it, along with Murray Rothbard. And so that you say that'd be interesting to see whether that would change when he dies. But it'd be interesting to see. But what do you think of my sort of pay people I like type thing, and paying researchers rather than setting up like a charitable organisation? Do you think this would actually fulfil my goals, or do you think that a charitable organisation would be better, or just don't even bother, or anything else you wish to respond to?
I guess the question is, uh, what is your quote unquote goal here again? I know this question isn't. I know organizations oftentimes have mission statements here, but if your goal is just to give people, a nice salary, then great. I don't. That's not an issue here. One of the critiques I think Sean Gabb have had of the Adam Smith Institute was that the Adam Smith Institute just made government employees more uh, work harder. Which, like, if you're trying to go after tax cheats, then in a sense, this might sound like a strange example, but if you're trying to go after tax cheats, then you don't really want them to work very hard. Or if you're trying to go after, if you want the FBI to be as lazy as possible, looking for all the people on the security cameras at around the Capitol. You want them to take as many coffee breaks as possible. Um, so in this sense, I it depends on what your goal is. There is a sense in which society, I think, needs places to store people who might be useful. I mean, this is I guess, my internal Marxism at times. You like to bring up the example that vicars used to invent a lot of stuff because they had a relatively easy job. I don't think that would be an Adam Smith Institute approved job, like just to read a sermon and get paid a nice salary. By the way, I don't think that'd be a like a this the guy of the French Revolution, Robespierre, or the Committee of Public Safety. I don't think that would be, I don't think the aristocrats who got to like live off peasants, or the all these, top people like Thomas Jefferson or Jefferson Davis, the American version who got to sit around reading philosophy all day and try to devise a theoretical government. So in that sense, you could say that they have the benefits of leisure, just to sit around, read, do do stuff with no direct purpose, and so forth, rather than something with an indirect purpose. So you can pass on obscure knowledge, write obscure books, read obscure books, come up with obscure ideas, and so forth. So yeah, I think it would work. It's just like there would probably be half the people would probably just do nothing. Maybe even more would do nothing. Now again, could you actually run it if you were a multi-billionaire? Whether or not a crime is behind every multi-billionaire, it seems like maintaining a fortune is a job. So, like, would that be in your time? You'd probably hire some director. Now, if it's like Lou Rockwell, maybe the director would be really good, and then it would be their egoism keeping it going. But chances are, Lou Rockwell might hire another person who eventually is the son of somebody who is, an idiot, or it has the opposite goals. Because I think 20% of people's children end up having the opposite goals of their parents, and all that, and then poof, then the organization is starting to be counterproductive based on its original goals. So like most of the people working for the Ford Foundation, probably, if Lou Rockwell was put in charge of the Ford Foundation, I mean, he probably gets assassinated or something like that. Um, I'm like, if you look at, like, I think Harvard was set up, or was it Yale? One of those schools was set up as like a Calvinist preaching school, I believe. And if you look at it today, it's like, excuse me, like, I forget which one of the Ivy League universities, but like, there's a big gap between what it currently does and what it doesn't do. And by the way, colleges in this sense are a strange kind of business as well, and so forth. So that would be my pushback here with respect to just paying people randomly. I think it would work. But I think you have to look over the fact that a lot of people might not do anything, or do what you want them to do. And to go back to my comments on working, which comes from, or why do people get out of bed in the morning? I do think, I do think, I do think that working is somewhat useful to do. Uh, uh, I did make comments about the Adam Smith Institute there, but I do think looking like working at times is useful. And maybe that's what foundations and nonprofits and charitables are for here, that they're just giant exercises in working theater. You know, if you have political theater, let's say you have working theater. These people who are looking busy but not really doing anything. Like, let's say you're going to go out and poll all voters. Um, you know what? Now there is some historical use in knowing what all voters think, or all Republican voters think. Um, but there is also a sense in which you just want to keep people hired by your organization, so that in the future, when you actually have a goal, let's say win an election for Nikki Haley, then you have a large, or Joe Biden or whatever, and you have a large stash of people who you know are hireable, but your actually goal you're doing them is entirely pointless. In that sense, here, I mean, they could just be eating lunch the whole time, and it wouldn't really change anything. So maybe that's there could be a huge amount of pointlessness towards the jobs that people assign to them. Yeah, so I think your solution would work. It's just that you might get a lot of pushback from people from different ends here. But if you could go ahead and try it. Would you be interested in giving, I don't know, like your kids or your family just infinite money here? Like, would that be something you're, or lots of money here? You know, as we stated with the why do people get out of bed in the morning episode, people like Hunter Biden probably would have been better off if they were from a poorer family or less powerful family. Uh, so maybe that's just a problem of wealth.
It's going to depend on the psychological makeup. I mean, I did consider my brother's done lots of work in sort of like improving and changing board games, and I was thinking, well, it can be cool to have more new good board games out. So, no, just pay him some money a year, he can leave his job and he can just become a board game designer, stuff like that. That did cross me. I wouldn't just do infinite money is a bad idea for anybody with that doesn't have an astonishingly good character or doesn't have any other constraints. Um, so I wouldn't be infinite money because you could get delayed and do other things, but no, a decent amount. Yeah, I considered that. Say it'd have to be on like an individual basis. But I suppose as well, what would my goal be? I suppose as well, they're finding stuff out that I'm interested in, and I just have to determine whether I think they were using their time productively or not, and if they weren't, then I just stop funding them. Or cut it until they did something better. So I might be like, well, come back to me in 3 months and tell me what we found out. And if I think that they found and made some progress, then fine. Now, clearly, some could be making stuff up or not doing that much with the money, but it's not perfect. I'm not going to be able to do that in a great way. I suppose the benefit of the thing I was suggesting here is that the money is actually going to people who seemingly are interesting and have ideas and want to research them, as opposed to just paying bureaucrats, which I loathe and detest. Just administrators and stuff just seem to be some of the most annoying people in the world, and I don't really
But
want to fund them.
wouldn't you say administrators? I'll be real quick. Wouldn't you say administrators are a byproduct of large organizations? You know, this goes back to the comments about like Aristotle and city size. Like once a city gets over 100,000, it seems like it's just a giant impersonal machine. So once an organization gets to a certain size, and the only real way to have a large fortune is to have a large organization. I think Kevin Carson, in this sense, is right. Whether a mega corporation could exist in the Capistan is a good question. But whether a mega fortune or mega philanthropist could exist is a good question. But it seems like they would have to have a lot of employees. Like, could you oversee? Like, even relatively small foundations have at least 100. Mid-sized foundations, I think, have at least 25. If you just hired 10 people, that's fine. I don't think that's disputable. But if you hired 100, can you really oversee 100 people here? In the same way that, like in a large city, you can't really, by definition, know everybody. Uh,
No, I agree. I know. I see that, and that would be an issue. But I suppose, insofar as they're in a for-profit organisation, we can at least ascertain their usefulness in a way that you can't really ascertain in the same way for research. Because I mean, what coordination or what kind of benefit really does an administrator have when a team of scientists are investigating some rocks somewhere, or some philosopher is reading books and producing and talking to me about the ideas he had and producing lectures or whatever? I mean, they seem not. They're just going to be there for hanging on, getting donations, whatever. So, in the case of a for-profit organization, at least I can determine whether they're useful. But of course, yeah, I mean, you can always raise the question. In Ancapistan, so I understand, does the multi-billionaire exist anyway? But I mean, even if he doesn't, I mean, even if I'm sort of like sufficiently wealthy, as wealthy can reasonably be, and I have some spare cash, and I think, well, how can I best use it? Well, I put it there. Oh, and also as well, as you mentioned, about solving world hunger, I probably put money towards sort of creating nuclear microreactor research, because that means that people around the world could have loads and loads of energy cheaply and reliably, which would be to massively improve their standard of living. I probably wouldn't bother with fusion power because that seems like it's not going to work, but at least we can scale what we already know. So yes, there still would be a problem with in a major organization of administration or whatever, so you can't avoid it in its entirety, but at least they're constrained in a way that they wouldn't be constrained appropriately in a sort of non-profit situation.
I don't really have any other further comments here. I do think it's an interesting topic. I just don't know. I'm just suspicious of most charitable organizations and nonprofits. Almost all political, non whatever you want to call them, political organizations or whatever, everything from campaign organizations to things like Doctors Without Borders. Um, I think a good reading of the Machiavellians or Vilfredo Pareto or Mosk gets you to the idea that they're not really being 100% honest about what their actual goals are. And on top of that, are their goals achievable? Like to go back to the homeless thing or solving Middle East peace. It doesn't seem like those are like. Do the people who do the recipients want to be solved? Okay, will they benefit from them? We know what a successful restaurant looks like. We know what a successful tire company looks like. But them, I don't know. So you could say there's not. I'm just repeating myself here, but I think it bears repeating. Is what is their goal, and is their goal achievable here? And many organizations that look like non-profitables are actually egoistic in centers, which is the same with a business here. So I think people, it might be a good idea to spend more time at organizations closer tied to, like sports, for example. The goal of a sporting team is to get faster, is to beat the other team. It's not to make the world a better place. If a byproduct does, then it's great. But maybe those things like maybe athletic scholarships might be a better thing if you want to help out people disadvantaged young men or something like that. Maybe that's a better way to help out them people rather than just sending the money on welfare checks or having them become bureaucratic agents. But again, if they become bureaucratic agents, in a sense, you're doing that because you like the well-managed, progressive type managed society anyway. So there's egoism in there too. Those will be my final comments. Thanks for doing this. I just don't know. I'm suspicious of charity in general. That's the only thing I would say, and suspicious of nonprofits too.
Yeah, I agree with the reservations. I think they're probably slightly more pro-charity than you are, but I think those reservations still stand. I'd just like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family and subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason at all, please contact us at mindcryinglibертyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcryinglibертyshow@gmail.com.